Thank you. That's a really beautifully written introduction. Well, I'm so glad to be here. If I can figure my iPad out. I can't believe it's been 10 years though. That just doesn't feel. That makes me feel really old because it's. I was just a baby, I guess. So thank you all for having me, and for letting me come back. I'm going to read just a little bit from Parchment of Leaves, since that's the book that was read in common. Talk a little bit about Parchment of Leaves, but also want to read from a pretty recent book called Eli the Good, just a short little scene from that. And I'm going to read a scene from my brand new book, which I'm hoping will be out in about a year. I've been working on it for, I don't know, about 5 years, so I'm so glad I can finally go around and start reading from it. So I'll use you all as one of my test audiences to see if it resonates in any way with you. But first, I will tell you just a little bit about it, and I also want to take questions. So I'm glad to always, like Shannon's saying, I always love to just sit and jaw, just talk. And so that's really why I like to come to these things, is to get to talk to people and not just to hear myself read, which I really get sick of. And the other authors in the room I know can identify with that. We get so tired of hearing ourselves talk, so it'd be nice to hear from you all. I think that this was the first place that did a Parchment of Leaves as a common read. It was a fairly new book at that time. It had been out about a year and a half, I guess. And I was so pleased for it to be used and read in that way, because it's such a special book to me. And even 12 years after its publication, it's still a really special book to me. And it's still the book that I get the most letters and emails about. These characters readers are more endeared to these characters than any I've ever written before. And that's really, the best part of that is I don't really feel responsible for these characters in the way that I do for my other characters. This book really wrote itself. And I can't say that for my other books. All of my other books have been, painful, awful, hellish journeys. Wonderful too, and filled with joy and all that, but really, really hard to do, really difficult. A Parchment of Leaves just came as if it was whispered into my ear, and I just sort of sat there and let the voice tell me what to do, as strange as that sounds. And it is the only book that I've had that experience with. I've heard other authors say that they have one book like that just sort of comes fully formed. When I started writing the book, I mainly wanted to do it because all my life I've been told that my great-grandmother was a full-blooded Cherokee. If you're from Eastern Kentucky, you're always told that. And I don't know if that's the same in Western Kentucky. Maybe it's just like that all over the South. But so I really wanted to find out if that was true. And so one thing that I do when I write a book to answer a question for myself. Every novel I've written is because I'm trying to figure out something. And so Parchment of Leaves really forced me to do that. And the main thing that it forced me to do was to delve deeper into my family history and really interview people in my family. So often we think, I'm going to sit down and tape my grandmother, and I'm going to write down all those stories and all that, and we never do it, and then it's too late. So that's one thing that I loved about this book, was that it forced me to do that. And I spent a lot of time with the older people in my family, whom had always been the primary storytellers in the family, but it was different to sit down and interview them. The big difference was that they totally froze up and couldn't answer your questions until you just... I finally learned to sort of give them a prompt to get rolling, that they would just, if they figured out that you were, trying to gather information at all, they wouldn't say anything, and they certainly didn't want to be on camera. So I would have to sneak and tape them. And you remember those little cassette recorders with the real little cassettes? I used those. And so I got lots of information, and the best information I got was from the oldest person in my family at that time, my Aunt Mildred, and she had known my great-grandmother pretty well. And while I was interviewing her, she at one point, she was answering a question, and she said, well, I believe she wrote about that in her little diary that she kept. It's right in here in the bedroom if you want to see it. And so, I had to keep myself from jumping up out of the chair and running down the hallway. So she gave me this little diary, but it's not a diary as we would think of it. It's more like 3rd September 1920, planted 18 rows of corn, walked 5 miles to town, saw such and such, bought a pound of coffee. And then, it'd be just like a list of daily activities. But then it will say something like, I'm so lonesome and blue tonight. And so it would be those one little lines like that that would help me to get into her mindset. I also did a lot of research on the Cherokee, and especially Cherokees who had hidden out after the removal, and worked their way up into Kentucky and Southwest Virginia. Found out that a lot of them became Quaker, and so that element I put into the book. So then I had to learn about the Quakers at the time. It's my most historical novel, so it required a whole lot of research, which I usually don't enjoy that much. But once I got all that finished, the book just came, and I just sort of sat back and put my fingers on the keyboard, and it's the only book that I can really talk about how proud I am of it, because I don't feel responsible for it. So I don't feel conceited when I talk about it, because it is all the voices of, especially the women that I heard growing up. And the women in my family were the primary storytellers. I think that overall that's probably the case in all families. When we get right down to it, the women usually are story bearers in that way. And so it is a novel of strong women. I thought it would be mostly a book about a interracial marriage, because my great-grandmother was full-blooded Cherokee and she was married to an Irishman. And I thought that it would just be about the difficulties of that. But once I started writing the book, it turned out that it was a book about forgiveness, and I think it's a book about forgiveness. There are all these little acts of forgiveness all throughout it. And it's also a book about marriage, and I guess those two things go hand in hand. You really got to have forgiveness to have marriage, right? So, and this little love triangle came up, which I did not expect at all. That was one thing about the book that I really had to let go of the reins and sit back, because I was writing a book about my great-grandmother, but suddenly she wanted to do all these things that you don't want your great-grandmother to do, like she wanted to consummate that marriage, for one thing, and she was very adamant about that, and so I had to allow her to do that and be a full human being in that way. So I had to release myself and distance myself that way. She also, and I don't want to ruin it for people who haven't read the book, but she also ends up killing a man, and I didn't know she was going to do that. And so at that point, the whole novel, takes a sharp turn, and I have to figure out how to get it back on track. So I'm just going to read you a little scene where you start to get hints of the love triangle happening. And the love triangle is between Vine and her husband and his brother, whom is in love with Vine. She does not reciprocate. And the book is told in her voice. As winter started to set in, I began to see something very clearly. It was as if I had been working on a quilt, and suddenly the pattern had taken on its shape and meaning. I seen that I had married a very quiet man, the opposite of myself, of my own father, of my own people. He was the opposite of his own people, in fact. For his mother, Esme, could out-talk any preacher, and Aaron was all the time going on with his notions and daydreams. Maybe it was the time of year that made me notice. The weather seemed to give me hints. Rain showers in the summer had come in with rumbling thunder, sheets of water pounding against the tin roof. wind that bent the trees low and set the leaves to chattering. But cold rain fell straight down in November and December, quiet, sometimes so gently that it seemed a damp mist you could walk through without becoming wet. The sounds of evening, crickets, frogs, katydids, were gone until spring. Even the creek silenced itself. The last of the leaves fell with no more sound than a dying breath. And Saul was quiet too, still and silent. But by the time the gray sky began to spit snow around Christmas, I didn't think I could stand it. Esme was a different person in the winter. She didn't venture outside much and spent the colder days fooling around in her kitchen with a big quilt thrown over her shoulders. She wasn't much in the way of company, since the only thing she wanted to talk about was her aching bones. She could always tell when a big snow was coming by the harsh pulsing in her joints. There was no solace in Serena either. When Serena finally started to show that she was carrying, she really showed. She was big as a cow by January, but still kept right on going out to catch babies, making her way over the slick rocks. I thought she was carrying twins, her belly was so big, but she always just shook her head and said that it was nothing more than a big old boy. So, Aaron kept me company. I was desperate for conversation, and he always gave me that much at least. He'd come up to the house every day after he had done everything that Esme had asked him to. He didn't have a job, even though he was plenty old enough for one. Somebody had to take care of his mother, he said, and he did. I don't have to say that much for him. Every day he chopped wood, shoveled coal, fed the goats, tended to the cows and chickens. He even helped her stitch quilts. Then he'd come and talk to me while I swept the house or turned the butter or hung clothes to dry over the fireplace. He helped me stack wood, clean the lamp chimneys, trim the wicks, shovel out the fireplace. Sometimes he even helped me cook, which was something I had never seen a man do in my life. My mother still had to pack meals to my bachelor uncle over on Redbud. He would have died and split hell wide open before putting a skillet on the stove. And all the while, Aaron talked. Most times I didn't even acknowledge what he was saying. I'd just go about my work, nodding every once in a while. Sometimes I'd stop him to comment, but mostly I just listened. When I did say something, I don't think he paid a bit of attention to it. He was concerned only with his own dreams. Yeah, they're building a new railroad up in West Virginia, cutting tunnels out through them big mountains. Them mountains is bigger up there than they are here. Can you picture that? He'd say. I'd like to go up yonder, just to watch them do it. Or I could be a photographer. I could go up there and take pictures of them building that new railroad. One thing always led into another, although most everything had to do with getting out of Kentucky. I never could understand why he wanted to leave. He had it made right here. Esme watched over him like he was a little child. In many ways, he was a child, dreaming of big things, his mind never focused on anything but having a big time. And I guess I was a child too. I was young after all. I was still adjusting to married life and the fact that I had to act like a grown woman. I had been raised up quick. My parents never given much time for the foolishness of childhood. But I was a young person. I dreamed too. Aaron got to where he would play his banjo for me right often, but only after I had sat down and stopped doing the chores. He couldn't stand to play the banjo unless he had my full attention. He knew all my favorites and always played the one I loved best, Little Sunshine. Aaron could play the banjo better than anybody I'd ever heard before, and I wasn't the only one to say that. His fingers picked in a blur, moving so quick and light that they seemed not even to touch the strings. The music he made on that banjo was like hearing magic. It was like Aaron held God's rhythm right in his fingertips. Every once in a while I could talk him into singing a little bit too. Mostly he just liked to play. I liked the way he sung Charlie's Neat. He hunched over the banjo and looked me right in the eye as he sung, making crazy old faces at the end of each verse. And then it was like he lit in on that banjo, rocking back and forth with it atop his lap, his fingers pulling out clucks and pops on the strings. Lord, it was something. The way that he could pull a sound out with nothing more than his thumb and his pointing finger. If you want to be something, I said, you ought to make a living playing that banjo. He thought this was funny. Shoot, Vine, he said, a man can't make no money playing music.